Last Sunday, the readings reminded us that being persistent in prayer is important. And today we add to persistence a second basic teaching, namely that our understanding of God and our understanding of ourselves are key elements for a life of prayer. If one of us, for example, were to pray for 2 hours each day, but had a false understanding of God or a false understanding of ourselves, we could end up in a very inauthentic place. So we listen to this parable carefully to be led to experience the mercy of God in our prayer and beyond. Jesus, in today's parable, contrasts two very different dispositions in prayer. The first is that of the Pharisee, who comes to the front of the temple. He is a faithful practitioner of religion. His prayer initially sounds like praise and thanksgiving to God. "Oh God, I thank you." But then soon we realize that something is wrong with this prayer. The Pharisee doesn't seem to be aware of the mysterious greatness, the goodness, the love of God. In fact, Jesus told us in the parable, the Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. In fact, then, he doesn't actually engage with God. The earlier readings help us to see the true nature of God that the Pharisee has missed out on or is unable to open his life to. The psalm told us, God hears the cry of the poor. The first reading told us, the Lord is a God of justice who knows no favorites, and also said, God hears the wail of the orphan and the complaint of the widow. And then we heard from Paul, although in prison, and he understands that the Lord will rescue me from every evil threat. And the gospel acclamation that was sung for us, God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ. God then, we understand from the scriptures, God is full of mercy. That is God's identity. And the Pharisee needs to get beyond the world of his own making so that he can encounter the God of mercy. Now, the second disposition in prayer is presented to us in the character of the tax collector. He understands the mercy of God. He understands that that is the true nature of God and that condemnation is not. Now, we deduce that the tax collector's behavior, at least his religious behavior, is not as exemplary as that of the Pharisee. He is working for the Roman Empire. He is charging taxes, and he's charging a commission on those taxes. And so he is a social outcast. And yet, this person who is a social outcast understands God's mercy. And he then prays, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." The tax collector of the two is the one who is actually praying. Let's join the tax collector. Let's join ourselves to his prayer. "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Because in praying for mercy, we are opening our own hearts so that God can move in and that we can experience God's mercy even in our prayer and hopefully beyond. The second truth that today's parable suggests is that our understanding of ourselves before God is important. God is merciful, and so the purest prayer will be offered by a humble person aware of his or her need for mercy. As the first reading said, the prayers of the lowly pierce the clouds. The prayers of the lowly reach God. And so we're not afraid of hearing the admonition that blessed are the poor in spirit. The Catechism of the Church says, asking forgiveness is a prerequisite to righteous and pure prayer. And so we understand ourselves as people in need of mercy, and we are humble enough to admit it. Now, perhaps the word humble has been misused in the church in the past. Keep quiet, shut up, be humble and pay. Maybe it has been misused. So we can be helped by C.S. Lewis, who says, "Humility is not thinking less of ourselves. Humility is thinking of ourselves less." God made us worthy. We are worthwhile. We are made in his likeness and image. And we have to allow him save us. Both. Every individual in the presence of God, our Creator, comes to recognize himself or herself as imperfect and needing God's help. So our disposition towards ourselves is to be humble, but hopeful. We're prompted to that hope by the second reading. Paul, in prison, facing trial, has great hope in what God can do for him. So let's be humble and also experience God's mercy in our prayer. Now, there is always a challenge in talking about prayer. First of all, we never feel we do enough of it, and then we don't feel we're skilled at it, and then we feel we are very good at withdrawing from prayer. And so let's not be too challenged by today's parable. God, we know, is merciful, and we understand we can grow. That's enough. So maybe one way to think about the parable in a creative way that could assist us in our prayer is to see it as presenting two distinct portraits of the same person. Two distinct portraits of the same person at different stages in his or her religious and spiritual life. The Pharisee then represents the early stage. And note, I am not saying the young stage. I'm not saying it's the characteristic of a young person, of the early stage, when a person might take up very definite positions religiously, maybe very clear about what religious positions they are opposed to, maybe even a religious position that is opposed to religion itself, tending to be rigid, believing in the importance of being strong. These sort of characteristics are suggested by the Pharisee. Focused on religious progress. Oh, I'm really doing very well here. I'm making progress. Speaking about themselves a great deal in their prayer. His or her own story is very much to the center of the prayer. Now, I know that many of us have been there. I've been there. I imagine many of us have been there. And so there is a real side to make that we need to be tolerant of those who are in that position and recognize that we and they are being invited on. And the second portrait then of the tax collector is the same person with a greater understanding of God and a greater understanding of themselves, aware of and humbled by the truth of their own darkness or limits. Maybe humbled by the work that they do, as in the case of the tax collector, because it doesn't seem to fulfill their dreams of themselves. Aware that making comparisons in the spiritual life is an expression of pride and must be avoided. There is nothing as damaging to the spiritual life as making comparisons with other people. And the tax collector then is more silent in his prayer. There are fewer words. Let's then recognize that the Lord can invite us to growth and to move us away from a false image of himself and ourselves so that we're drawn into God's mercy. Let that disposition of the tax collector overtake us so that we can experience God's mercy even in our prayer.